Are you sure you know exactly where the deceased are? Physicist Yuri Ivanov claims. They're not where we're used to thinking. His discoveries changed the concepts of life and death. Official science could not disprove his conclusions, although many try to silence him. The conducted experiments prove consciousness does not disappear, it continues to exist in another reality. But what is this place? Why do some souls leave this world earlier than we expect? We have been taught that after death, everything ends. But what if it is just a transition to another state? Ivanov's discovery questions the usual worldview. He collected numerous testimonies from people who claimed they had met the souls of the deceased, communicated with them, and received signs from them. But the most amazing thing is that some of them apparently do not leave this world forever. Yuri Ivanov was attempted to be silenced. Who and why? What are they hiding from us? What you are about to learn will make you think about what happens after death. It all started with a seemingly ordinary event. In the summer of 1988, on one of the warm days in May, the house was filled with fresh air and the singing of birds. The scent of blooming trees wafted through the open window. Natalia, Yuri Ivanov's wife, returned from the market, holding a fresh bouquet of tulips in her hands. With a gentle smile, she placed them in a glass vase with water. For a few seconds, she stared at the flowers, then, without taking her eyes off them, she whispered quietly, "They are fantastic, especially these light green edges on the petals." Yuri, who was reading a book, looked up. He looked at the bouquet and frowned. What edges? He carefully examined the flowers. Red, yellow, pink, but no glowing edges were visible. He leaned closer, blinked. Nothing changed. "Natasha, maybe you're just tired?" he suggested. His wife shook her head. "No, I've been noticing this for a long time. Sometimes I see such glowing around people, my hands, objects, but I thought it was just eye fatigue or an optical effect." Yuri thought about it. He was a physicist, a man of science, used to explaining everything logically. In his worldview, there were no glowing phenomena or energies. But he knew his wife didn't tend to fantasize. "Let's check this," he said, and stood up. He took the camera, took a few shots from different angles in different lighting. When he developed the film, there was nothing unusual in the photos. The same tulips, no glowing edges. "See? Just ordinary flowers," he said, showing her the pictures. But something inside him wouldn't let go. He knew that human perception is a complex matter. There are optical illusions, vision defects, the play of light. But what if Natalia had actually seen something real, just that he hadn't noticed it himself? From that moment, his attitude towards such phenomena changed. Before, he would have simply dismissed it and forgotten about it. But now doubt began to grow within him. What if his wife wasn't the only one confronted with something like this? Driven by this thought, he began his long journey. He looked for other people who had experienced something similar. He read articles, interviewed acquaintances, spoke to scientists, and even to old-school doctors. Thus, he took the first step into a new world, a world he had previously dismissed as fantasy. In the fall of 1988, he decided to conduct his first serious experiment. This was the moment when the convinced materialist questioned the usual laws of physics and tried to look beyond the boundaries of the familiar world. He didn't know that this experiment would forever change his concept of reality. He prepared everything necessary, a film sealed securely in 2 layers of light-proof paper. No external light could penetrate, and there were no external factors that could influence the result. A pure experiment, excluding all errors or accidents. "Are you ready?" he asked Natalia. She nodded, looked intently at the film, and slowly raised her hands. There was a tense silence in the room. Yuri observed her movements with interest. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Only the slight trembling of her fingers and the focused expression on her face revealed the tension. Then Natalia closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and slowly exhaled. "I feel something," she whispered. Yuri felt nothing. It all seemed to him like a play of imagination. He was convinced that the experiment would prove there was no phenomenon. But when the film was developed, he was speechless. Strange spots appeared on the surface. In the middle, they were brighter than at the edges, as if some kind of radiation had passed through the film. Everything looked as though it had been overexposed. "This can't be," he muttered, looking at the pictures over and over again. It could be a mistake in the film, a chemical reaction, or a random malfunction. He couldn't allow himself to believe in something unprovable. He was a scientist, so he did what a real researcher would do. He repeated the experiment. He used a different film, changed the conditions, checked for any possible light leaks. But the result was the same. Each time, spots or glowing streaks appeared on the pictures. It couldn't be a coincidence. Two people were fighting inside him. The scientist who tried to explain the occurrence logically, and the human who was beginning to understand that the world was more complex than he had thought. That's when he started to think for the first time, what if this is really the biofield? The one he had only heard of from people he considered charlatans? But it was impossible to believe without solid evidence. Ivanov decided to go to the end and methodically study the phenomenon like a true scientist. But soon, he encountered an even more astonishing phenomenon. One day, he got a headache. A regular headache that everyone has from time to time. Natalia suddenly said, "Let me try to help you." "How?" He grinned skeptically. "Just sit quietly." She stood behind him and slowly raised her hands above his head. Yuri suddenly felt a slight warmth, as if an invisible wave passed through him. Several minutes passed, and suddenly the headache disappeared. It didn't lessen or decrease, but simply vanished as if it had never been there. "This is impossible," he whispered, blinking his eyes. Yuri tried to find a rational explanation. Autosuggestion, placebo effect, a random coincidence. But the fact remained. The pain was gone. From that moment on, he understood. Something incomprehensible was happening around him. But instead of simply dismissing it, as any skeptic would, Ivanov decided to search for answers. He gathered many stories, all of which confirmed one thing. The connection between the living and the dead is not interrupted even after death. These stories sounded incredible, but they were repeated over and over by different people in different places across the country. And they were told by those who didn't seek fame, didn't write books, didn't give lectures. One of the stories impressed him more than all the others. Arthur Saknenko, an officer in the armed forces, told his father, who had died of lung cancer. It was a long, agonizing illness. Arthur spent the last days of his father's life at his bedside, hearing the wheezing breath and feeling how the person who meant everything to him was fading away. Every night, when he fell asleep, he dreamed of seeing his father once more, simply to talk, to hear his voice. And one day it happened. In the dream, he saw his father alive and healthy, as if the illness had never existed. They were standing by the shore of an unknown body of water, surrounded by soft, misty fog, and the air was fresh, like on an autumn morning. "It's interesting to live here," said his father. Arthur smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes. "It's hard to be alone," the father continued. "Soon, my friend Shinya will come here, and then it will be easier." The dream ended. Arthur awoke with a heavy feeling. Was it just a dream? Or is it more? And a few weeks later, he received the horrifying news. Shinya, his father's friend, had died. After that, his father no longer appeared in his dreams. It seemed as if his mission had been completed. But this was not the only story. Julia Passo, a young woman from a small town, told Ivanov of a childhood memory she had kept her whole life. When her grandmother died, it was a true tragedy for her. The girl cried for a long time and couldn't come to terms with the loss. It seemed as though the house was empty, as if part of the world had disappeared. And one day, as she lay in bed, she suddenly felt that someone was in the room. It wasn't scary. On the contrary, it felt warm and familiar. Julia turned around. Standing next to the bed was her grandmother. She looked just as she always had, only slightly transparent, as though she were illuminated from within. The girl froze, unable to move. "If you keep crying, I won't come to you again," said her grandmother softly. And the apparition disappeared. In the morning, Julia told her mother about it. The woman stroked her head and said, "You must have dreamed." But Julia knew it wasn't a dream. Later, her grandmother came to her several more times. Sometimes in a dream, sometimes just as she had the first time. But on the last occasion, on the 40th day after her death, she said, "I'm going to my duty." After that, she never appeared again. Yuri Ivanov pondered these stories. Coincidence? Fantasy? Autosuggestion? But there were too many such cases, and they happened to people who didn't even believe in such things. These stories forced him to reconsider his views on life and death. He understood, a person's consciousness doesn't disappear. It remains, interacts, transmits messages. If that's the case, does it mean that life and death are not opposites, but only transitions in a flow? The deeper Ivanov delved into this topic, the clearer an important conclusion became. Every person comes into this world with a specific task. But what does that mean? Are we born with a predetermined fate, or do we set the accents on our own path? He noticed a regularity. People who found their calling seemed to receive energy from above. They moved forward, created, discovered new things. Their health grew stronger, their thoughts clearer. They lived because they followed their path. But there were others as well. Those who felt the void. Those who couldn't find themselves. People who burned through their days aimlessly or did things that brought them no joy. Over time, they withered, fell ill, and passed away. Their bodies seemed no longer to receive the necessary impulse for life. Maybe a person lives as long as they fulfill their mission. If we consider the spiritual world as an artist creating a work of art, then the person is his work. Sometimes the master works long on his masterpiece and brings it to perfection. And sometimes he realizes that the work is a failure and begins anew. Ivanov thought, if a person doesn't fulfill their task, their body deteriorates, like a mechanism that no longer serves its purpose. But the most astonishing thing was something else. Sometimes people left far too early, not because they had failed, but because their mission had already been completed. How can one explain the phenomenon when brilliant individuals leave at the height of their powers? Why do some children live only a few years, but in that short time, they change the world? Perhaps their soul had already done everything it needed to do, and their presence here was no longer necessary. In this thought lay a frightening but fascinating meaning. Everything is more complex than it seems. Perhaps the spiritual world is not an invention, but the key to understanding our fate. But if that's the case, what comes next? How can one recognize their mission? Can one understand whether a person has fulfilled their destiny or whether their time is up? There are no answers yet. But Ivanov knew one thing: we still have much to discover.